My husband died 6 months ago, but yesterday I saw him alive at a store. I followed him. He got into a car with another woman. She called him husband. When I walked up to them and knocked on the window, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Denton, Texas for 41 years. The oak tree in the backyard, the one Gerald planted the summer our daughter Karen was born, is still there. It's taller than the roof now. I used to sit under it with my morning coffee and think that some things in life are permanent. The tree, the house, my marriage. I was wrong about the last one. Gerald and I were married for 38 years. 38 years of Sunday dinners and arguments about the thermostat, and vacations to the same lake house in Arkansas every August. We had 2 children, Karen and our son Thomas, and 4 grandchildren between them. We had a retirement plan, a joint savings account, and a life insurance policy worth $400,000 that Gerald had insisted on taking out 10 years ago. "For your peace of mind, Maggie," he'd said, "in case anything happens to me." He was always very careful about that policy. I should have asked myself why. Instead, I believed him. I believed everything. When he started coming home late from his job at the property management company, I told myself it was the Henderson account, a large commercial property that had been giving him trouble for months. When he began sleeping on the far edge of the bed, turned away from me like a man guarding something private, I told myself it was his back. Gerald had always had a bad back. When he started taking his phone into the bathroom, something he'd never done in 38 years of marriage, I told myself he was watching those football highlight videos that Thomas had shown him how to find on YouTube. I told myself a great many things. There were smaller signs, too, ones I cataloged only later, in the terrible silence after. He had lost weight, perhaps 20 pounds over the course of a year, weight that made him look younger, sharper. He had bought new clothes that didn't look like Gerald at all. Fitted shirts, dark jeans, shoes that weren't the beaten New Balance sneakers he'd worn since Obama's first term. He had started going to the gym, which he called the doctor's orders, after a routine physical. He had changed the password on his laptop. But I was 66 years old and I was tired, and it is very easy when you are tired to choose the explanation that requires the least from you. Then, in February of last year, Gerald had a heart attack. That's what they told me. That's what the death certificate said. He collapsed at work, alone in his office on a Friday afternoon when his assistant had already left for the weekend. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. The paramedics, the hospital, the doctor who spoke to me in that small beige room, they all said the same thing. Massive myocardial infarction. He would not have suffered long. I buried an empty casket. The funeral director had gently explained that the condition of the body made an open casket inadvisable. I had been too destroyed to question it. I collected the life insurance. $412,000 after processing fees. I gave a portion to Karen and Thomas. I sat under the oak tree and cried until I had no more tears left, and then I cried some more. For 6 months, I grieved. And then, on a Tuesday morning in August, a bright, indifferent morning that smelled of cut grass and coming rain, I drove to the Kroger on Elm Street to buy milk, eggs, and the specific brand of herbal tea that helps me sleep. I was in the cereal aisle when I saw him. He was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps the fitted shirt made him look that way. His hair was different, shorter, with a trace of gray that I didn't recognize. He was pushing a cart, studying the back of a box of granola with the focused, slightly squinting expression I had watched him make 10,000 times over 38 years. the expression he made when he was reading without his glasses. I stopped walking. The box of tea I was holding fell to the floor. He didn't look up. He set the granola in his cart and pushed it forward and rounded the corner toward the dairy section, and I stood very still in the cereal aisle of the Kroger on Elm Street, in the town where we had lived together for 4 decades, watching my dead husband do his grocery shopping. I followed him. I don't remember making the decision. I remember that my legs moved and that the fluorescent lights above me seemed very bright and that I could hear my own breathing. He moved through the store at a comfortable pace, unhurried, pausing to add items to his cart. He looked healthy. He looked rested. He looked, I realized, with a sickness that started in my stomach and spread outward like cold water. Happy. He paid at the self-checkout and walked out into the parking lot. I followed him through the sliding doors into the August heat. A silver Honda Accord was parked in the 3rd row. A woman was sitting in the passenger seat, younger than me by perhaps 15 years, with dark hair pulled back from her face. When Gerald reached the car and opened the trunk to load his bags, she rolled down her window and said something. She was smiling. I was close enough, in that flat, carrying Texas heat, to hear exactly what she said. She said, "Did you get the good granola, husband?" And Gerald laughed. He laughed the way he used to laugh with me. Easy, comfortable, like a man entirely at home in his life. I was standing 12 feet away. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my purse. The sound made him turn. For one moment, one long, stretched, terrible moment, Gerald Calloway looked directly at me. His face went white. And then I walked to that car and I knocked on the window, and the world as I had understood it for 67 years came apart at the seams. He didn't run. I think I had expected him to run. Instead, Gerald stood very still beside the open trunk of that silver Honda, his grocery bags at his feet, and looked at me the way a man looks at something he has spent a great deal of energy pretending does not exist. The color had drained from his face completely. I could see the pulse in his throat. I had kissed that throat 10,000 times. I had pressed my ear against that chest and listened to the heart that was supposedly dead. The woman, his wife, had gotten out of the car by then. She was perhaps 50, slim, with the kind of careful, maintained appearance that speaks of effort and intention. She wore a yellow blouse. I remember the yellow blouse very clearly. She looked from Gerald to me and back to Gerald with an expression that shifted in the space of 3 seconds from confusion to something I can only describe as calculation. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. He said my name. Just that, Maggie, in a voice so low it was almost nothing. "You're dead," I said. It came out very flat, very ordinary, the way you might say it's raining or the mail is here. "I buried you. I have a death certificate. I watched them put your casket in the ground at Westland Cemetery on February the 19th. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. The woman in the yellow blouse stepped forward and touched his arm. It was a proprietary gesture, the unconscious movement of someone who is accustomed to ownership, and it hit me somewhere behind my sternum like a physical blow. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. I drove home. I don't know how. I don't remember traffic lights or turns or parking in the driveway. I remember sitting in the car for a long time after the engine was off, looking at the front door of my house, at the potted geraniums on the porch steps that I had planted in the spring because planting things had felt like an act of faith, a declaration that I intended to continue living. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table. the same table where Gerald and I had eaten 38 years of meals, and I put my hands flat on the wood, and I breathed. Then I started to count. $412,000. That was what the insurance company had paid me. And what I now understood was not a death benefit, but stolen money. Money obtained through fraud, through the faking of a death, through the deliberate and calculated destruction of my life and the lives of my children. I had given Karen $80,000 of it, which she had used as a down payment on a house. I had given Thomas $60,000, which he had invested. The remainder sat in my savings account, where I had been drawing it down slowly, carefully, the way you do when you believe it is the last money your husband will ever earn. But the money was only part of it. 38 years. 38 years of a life I now had to re-examine from the beginning, looking for the seams, the places where the real story showed through the one I had been told. How long had he been planning this? How long had the woman in the yellow blouse been a part of his life? How long had I been sleeping beside a man who was rehearsing his own disappearance? I thought about Karen and Thomas. They had grieved. They had stood at a graveside in February cold and wept for their father. Thomas had taken 2 weeks off work. Karen had driven 4 hours from Houston and slept in the guest bedroom for 10 days, sitting with me in the evenings and holding my hand. They had grieved for something that was not real, for a death that had been manufactured, for a father who had looked at his children's love and decided it was worth less than a clean start. The anger, when it came, was very quiet. That surprised me. I had expected something loud and shattering, the kind of anger that breaks dishes and says words you can't take back. What I felt instead was a cold, clear, steady thing, like a flame that burns without flickering because there is no wind left to disturb it. I was not going to cry. I had already given 6 months of tears to a fiction. I went to my bedroom and I opened the box on the top shelf of my closet where I keep important papers. The box Gerald had always teased me about, calling me the family archivist. Inside it, our marriage certificate, the deed to the house in both our names, his life insurance policy, the death certificate, medical records from the hospital. I spread them on the bed and I looked at them for a long time. Then I did the thing that Gerald had clearly never believed I would do. He had always underestimated me. In 38 years, that had been his single most consistent mistake. I picked up the phone and I called my daughter. "Karen," I said, when she answered, "I need you to come to Denton. Don't bring the children, and don't tell your brother yet. I need to talk to you first." I paused. "I saw your father today." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. "Mom," she said finally, "what do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree in the yard, at the late afternoon light moving through its branches. "He's alive, Karen. Your father is alive. And I am going to need a lawyer." That was the moment I stopped being a grieving widow. That was the moment I became something else entirely. Karen arrived the next morning. She drove through the night, and when I opened the front door at 6:15 a.m., she looked the way I felt. Hollowed out. Running on something grimmer and more durable than sleep. She was 41 years old, my daughter, with Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness, and she stood on the porch with her overnight bag and looked at me for a long moment before she stepped inside and put her arms around me. We didn't speak for almost a minute. "Tell me everything," she said finally at the kitchen table, with coffee in front of both of us. I told her. I told her about the cereal aisle and the granola and the silver Honda and the woman in the yellow blouse. I told her about the 12 feet of parking lot between us and the sound of that woman's voice saying, "Husband." I told her about Gerald's face going white and the way he had said my name, not with guilt, not with remorse, but with the stunned, almost offended expression of a man whose careful plan has been inconvenienced. Karen's hands wrapped around her coffee mug were absolutely still. "The insurance money," she said. "Yes." She set the mug down. "Mom, what he did, what you're describing, that's not just leaving someone. That's criminal. That's insurance fraud. I know what it is," I said. "That's why I need a lawyer." His name was Robert Delaney. Karen found him. She had a colleague who had used him in a contentious divorce, and Karen had always been efficient in a crisis, had always been the child who responded to emergency by making lists. Robert Delaney was 55, with an office in downtown Denton, and a reputation, Karen's colleague said, for being methodical and entirely without sentimentality. Those were exactly the qualities I required. We met with him that same afternoon. I brought the box, the marriage certificate, the insurance policy, the death certificate, the medical records, all of it. I sat across from Robert Delaney's desk and I laid it out clearly. Everything I had seen, everything I suspected, everything I knew. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "if what you're describing is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, your husband has committed insurance fraud, identity fraud, and potentially conspiracy. The insurance company will want to be involved. The FBI handles insurance fraud cases of this scale." He paused. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Are you prepared for what this means? For your family? For your children?" I thought about Thomas, who still didn't know. I thought about the 4 grandchildren who called Gerald Grandpa Jerry and had cried at his funeral. "I'm prepared," I said. "Then let's begin." What followed was 2 weeks of careful, quiet work. The kind that happens in offices and on phone calls and in paper trails, invisible from the outside, devastating in its accumulation. Robert contacted the insurance company first. A man named David Park, a senior investigator for the company, came to Denton within 48 hours of Robert's call. He sat in my living room and asked me questions for 2 hours, and his expression, which began as professionally neutral, shifted gradually into something that looked like controlled outrage. "We paid this claim 8 months ago," he said, at one point, almost to himself. "I know," I said. "Gerald always was good with timing." Meanwhile, Robert hired a private investigator named Sheila Voss. Sheila was a small, quiet woman in her late 40s who dressed like she was going to a PTA meeting and moved through the world with a kind of absolute, unassuming invisibility that I came to understand was her greatest professional asset. Within 4 days, Sheila had located Gerald. He and the woman in the yellow blouse, her name, Sheila informed me, was Diane Mercer, were living in a rented house in Frisco, 30 miles from Denton. Gerald was working under the name Gerald Cole, his mother's maiden name, at a small property management firm, a career so similar to his previous one that it struck me as almost contemptuous in its lack of imagination. Diane Mercer had a Texas driver's license listing her occupation as a real estate agent. They had been together, based on what Sheila had uncovered, for at least 3 years. 3 years. Our marriage had still had 3 years left in it when he had begun building the life he intended to replace it with. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Sheila delivered her preliminary report in person, photographs included. Karen was there. Robert Delaney was on the phone. I looked at the photographs. Gerald coming out of a Starbucks. Gerald mowing the lawn of a house that was not mine. Gerald and Diane at what appeared to be a neighborhood barbecue. laughing with people who knew him as someone who had never had a wife of 38 years, had never stood at an altar in a church in Denton, Texas, had never planted an oak tree in a backyard for a daughter who was now sitting across from me with her hands balled into fists. "Is this enough?" I asked Robert. "This, combined with what the insurance investigator has," he said, "is more than enough to refer to the FBI." I looked at the photograph of Gerald laughing at the barbecue. He was holding a beer. He looked, I thought again, genuinely happy, as though no one had been hurt, as though the happiness were free. "Then refer it," I said. I didn't know yet that Sheila's car had been noticed, parked twice near their street. I didn't know that Diane, who was sharper than Gerald had ever been, had written down Sheila's license plate. But I would find out very soon. The FBI field office in Dallas assigned the case to a special agent named Patricia Horton. She called me on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after I had knocked on the window of that silver Honda. And her voice was the voice of a woman who has heard many things and is not easily surprised by any of them. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I've reviewed the materials forwarded by your attorney and by the insurance investigator. I'd like to meet with you in person." We met in Robert Delaney's office that Friday. Agent Horton was perhaps 45, with short gray hair and the particular quality of attention that I have since come to associate with people who are very good at their jobs. A stillness, a focus, the sense that nothing you say will be lost or mischaracterized. She asked careful questions. She looked at everything I had brought. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said, before she left. "This investigation will take time. These cases require building a complete evidentiary picture. I need you to be patient, and I need you to continue living your life as normally as possible. Don't confront him. Don't contact him. Let us work." I told her I understood. I meant it. What I had not accounted for, what none of us had fully accounted for, was Diane Mercer. She called me 4 days later. My personal cell phone, a number she should not have had. I answered because I didn't recognize the number, and for a half second before she spoke, I thought it might be Agent Horton. "Margaret," she said. Her voice was warm, composed, the voice of a woman who has decided that the best defense is a posture of absolute reasonableness. "I think we need to talk." I said nothing. "I understand you're upset," she continued. "What you saw must have been a terrible shock. But I need you to understand that Gerald left your marriage because he was unhappy. He was deeply unhappy for a very long time. He's a different person now. He's well. He's at peace. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever attorney you've hired, I'm asking you, one woman to another, to consider the consequences for everyone involved. For your children, for your grandchildren." A pause, carefully timed. "For yourself." I let her finish. Then I said very quietly, "Did you know he was married when you met him?" Silence. "Did you know he had children, grandchildren? Did you know he was going to fake his own death and let those grandchildren stand at a graveside and cry?" More silence. "Don't call this number again," I said. "The next conversation you have will be with a federal agent." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but my voice had not shaken once. I was proud of that. They escalated 2 days later. Gerald himself appeared at my door. I saw him through the window, standing on my porch, on the porch where we had sat together on summer evenings, and the sight of him there, solid and living, in the place where I had mourned him, produced in me an emotion so complex that I cannot fully name it even now. There was rage. There was grief. There was, underneath both of those, the remnant of 38 years of love. Not gone, not cleanly gone, but transformed into something that no longer had any warmth in it. I did not open the door. I called Robert Delaney. He called Agent Horton. Within the hour, I had been advised to document the visit and informed that a second visit would constitute grounds for a restraining order. Gerald left after 12 minutes of standing on my porch. I watched him through the window the entire time. He looked older than he had in Sheila's photographs. He looked, I thought, frightened. Good. The following week, a man I didn't recognize sat in a car across the street from my house for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. I photographed the car, the license plate, and the man, with the small digital camera that Thomas had given me for Christmas 3 years ago and which I had never used until now. I sent the photographs to Robert and to Agent Horton. The man did not return. That was the moment, I think, that Diane and Gerald understood they had made a serious miscalculation. They had expected a grieving old woman. They had expected someone who could be reasoned with, or frightened, or worn down by the sheer exhaustion of the fight. They had not expected someone who photographed surveillance cars and forwarded the evidence to the FBI. After that, for a short while, they went quiet. And I, on the advice of my attorney and the quiet insistence of my daughter, allowed myself 3 days. Karen took me to San Antonio, somewhere I had not been in years, somewhere without the oak tree and the kitchen table, and the particular weight of a life that had been built in one place and then detonated. We walked along the river walk in the evenings. We ate good food. We sat in the hotel room and watched old movies, and Karen fell asleep with her head on my shoulder the way she had when she was small. On the last morning, I sat on the hotel balcony with my coffee and looked at the river below and thought, I am still here. Whatever he took from me, he did not take this. He did not take me. I went home ready. The offer came through a lawyer, not Robert Delaney. Another lawyer, one I had never heard of, a man named Craig Sutton, who sent a formal letter to Robert's office approximately 3 weeks after San Antonio. The letter was written in the careful, bloodless language of legal correspondence, but its meaning was plain enough. Gerald Calloway, referred to throughout as our client, was prepared to make a financial settlement. The proposed amount was $200,000 to be paid in a lump sum in exchange for my agreement to withdraw my cooperation from the federal investigation, to make no further statements to law enforcement, and to characterize the life insurance claim as a misunderstanding arising from miscommunication between parties. I read the letter twice at Robert's desk. Then I set it down. A misunderstanding, I said. Robert, to his credit, said nothing. He had the good sense to simply wait. He faked his death, I said. He collected $400,000 in fraudulent insurance. He let my children grieve him. He let my grandchildren bury an empty casket. I looked at the letter again. And he's offering me $200,000 to call it a misunderstanding. That is what the letter says, Robert confirmed. What does the FBI say? Agent Horton's position is that your cooperation is voluntary, and that any decision you make is yours to make. She did ask me to note, however, that accepting this offer would not protect your husband from federal prosecution. The insurance company is a separate complainant, and the FBI investigation proceeds regardless of your personal participation. What it would do is remove your testimony from the case. I thought about that. I thought about the weight a jury might give to a wife of 38 years, standing in a federal courtroom, explaining what it had been like to grieve a man who was playing house in Frisco. Tell Craig Sutton no, I said. Tell him that I appreciate the offer and that I decline it entirely, and that if his client contacts me again through any channel, I will be adding harassment to the list of concerns I've shared with Agent Horton. Robert smiled. It was a small smile, brief and professional, but it was there. What I had not fully understood, until the weeks following San Antonio, was how much I needed other people. I am a private woman by nature. Gerald had always been the social one, the one who remembered neighbors' birthdays and organized the block's 4th of July cookout. Without him, I had retreated inward, had let the circle of my daily life contract to the kitchen table and the oak tree and the phone calls with Karen and Thomas. Thomas, by now, knew everything. I had called him the night I returned from San Antonio, and the conversation had been one of the hardest of my life. Not because Thomas fell apart, but because he didn't. He was very still on the phone, the way he goes still when he is containing something large, and then he said, "Mom, tell me what you need." No recriminations, no panic. Just that. It nearly broke me in an entirely different way. But it was my neighbor Dorothy who surprised me most. Dorothy Reeves was 70, a retired schoolteacher who had lived 3 houses down for 20 years, and whom I had always liked without ever quite moving past the level of pleasant neighbor friendliness. She brought me a casserole in the week after Gerald's funeral, and I had thanked her warmly and thought little more of it. But Dorothy had sharp eyes and a long memory. And one morning in September, about a week after my return from San Antonio, she knocked on my door and said simply, "I know something is going on, Margaret. I've known for a while. I'm not going to pry, but I'm here if you need me, and I have very good coffee." I let her in. I told her everything. It took 2 hours and most of her coffee and a box of crackers she found in my cupboard. Dorothy listened the way good teachers listen, without interrupting, without inserting herself, asking only the questions that would help me be more precise. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized. Not pity, not horror, but the clear-eyed, steady regard of someone who is recalculating you upward. "You're handling this right," she said. Those 4 words meant more to me than I would have predicted. Through Dorothy, I was connected to a small group. 4 women, ranging in age from 62 to 74, all of whom had navigated in various ways betrayals and losses, and the specific exhaustion of being underestimated by people who should have known better. We met on Thursday evenings at Dorothy's house, initially for what Dorothy called coffee and complaining, and which gradually became something more substantial. They did not know all the details of my situation. I was careful about what was public and what was not. But they knew enough, and they were, each in their own way, ferociously in my corner. I thought about what Gerald had banked on, an old woman, alone, too frightened and too tired to fight. He had been wrong about the alone, and he had been catastrophically wrong about the tired. They came on a Sunday. I didn't know they were coming. There had been no call, no letter through Craig Sutton's office. Nothing. I was in the backyard that October afternoon, sitting under the oak tree with a cup of tea and a library book I wasn't really reading, when I heard the doorbell. I went around the side of the house, still holding my book, and found them on my porch. Both of them. Gerald was wearing a gray jacket I had never seen. He looked nervous. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular stiffness that had always been his tell in difficult conversations. Diane was beside him, and she was dressed very carefully, neat, conservative, a dove-gray cardigan, small pearl earrings, no excess of anything. She looked like a woman who had put considerable thought into what a reasonable person looked like. "Maggie," Gerald said. I stood at the edge of the porch and I looked at them both. And I said nothing. "We were hoping we could talk," he continued. "Just talk. No lawyers. No—" He stopped, started again. "I know I owe you a conversation. A real one. I know that. And I know I've handled things badly." He paused. More than badly. We both felt, Diane said, stepping in smoothly, that a direct conversation would be more productive than all of this. Paperwork, intermediaries. We thought if we could just sit down together, like adults, we could find a way through this that doesn't have to destroy everyone. I looked at her pearl earrings. I thought about the fact that she had called my phone and told me to consider the consequences for my grandchildren. Come in, I said. I saw the flicker of surprise they tried not to show. They had expected resistance at the door. They had not expected to be invited inside. That surprise told me everything I needed to know about their actual confidence in this plan. I brought them into the living room. I did not offer them coffee. I sat in the armchair that had been mine for 30 years, and I let them take the sofa, and I looked at them across the room, and I waited. Gerald began with a speech I suspected he had rehearsed. He was sorry. He had been lost, had been struggling in ways he hadn't known how to articulate, had made decisions that he understood now, with clarity, were wrong. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was only asking me to consider. He was very careful with this word consider, whether what we were now embarked upon was truly necessary. The federal involvement, the investigation. He was a grandfather. He was thinking of the children, of Karen and Thomas, of how this would land on them publicly, on their careers, on their families. I watched his face as he spoke. 38 years of reading that face. Then Diane took over, and she was smoother, much smoother. She spoke about complexity, about long marriages, about the ways people change, about how the legal system was a blunt instrument for what were fundamentally human problems. She said, and she said it kindly, in the voice of someone delivering wisdom, that pursuing this case would not give me back what I had lost, that no verdict, no sentence would undo the years, that at my age, the energy required, the exposure, the stress, could not possibly be worth it. At my age, there it was. I had been waiting for it, and there it was, wrapped in cashmere and pearl earrings. Let me make sure I understand, I said. My voice was very even. I had been practicing this evenness for weeks, without quite knowing it. You are asking me, in my own living room, to stop cooperating with a federal investigation into fraud that robbed me of $400,000 and caused my children to grieve a death that never happened, because it might be stressful for me. At my age, Gerald's jaw tightened. Maggie, I'm also hearing, I continued, that you're concerned about the effect on Karen and Thomas. That's interesting. Were you concerned about them in February when you made them stand at a graveside? Were you concerned about my granddaughter Lily, who had nightmares for 2 months after your funeral? She's 8, Gerald. She had nightmares. The room was very quiet. Diane tried once more. She had clearly decided, in the absence of the reasonable approach, to try something with more edge. Margaret, she said, I want to be honest with you. What you're doing, the way you're going about this, it's going to be examined too. Your finances, your receipt of the insurance payment, your choices since February. These investigations aren't one-directional. People who think they're in a straightforward position often find out they're not. It was a threat, dressed as candor, but a threat. I stood up. That surprised them too. I'd like you to leave my house now, I said. Both of you. If you contact me again, in person, by phone, through any intermediary, I will report it immediately to Agent Horton, and I will add it to the record. Do you understand me? Gerald looked at me for a long moment. He looked at me the way I imagine you look at a place you thought you knew well, and are realizing too late that you never understood at all. They left. I stood in the living room after their car had gone, and I let myself feel what I actually felt, which was fear. Genuine, physical fear, a cold unease that settled in my chest and did not go away immediately. What Diane had said about the investigation being two-directional had found a target in me, had lodged in the place where my doubts lived. What if they tried to complicate things? What if they found a way to make me look complicit? What if? But then I thought of 8-year-old Lily and her nightmares, and the fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It compressed, hardened, became something that was not comfortable but was useful. A whetstone. I called Agent Horton that evening and reported the visit in full detail. When I went to bed that night, I was more resolved than I had been at any point since that parking lot in August. The indictment came in November. Robert Delaney called me on a Tuesday morning, and I could hear in his voice, carefully controlled, professionally measured, something that I recognized as satisfaction. Gerald Calloway has been indicted on 4 counts, he said. Insurance fraud, wire fraud, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Diane Mercer has been indicted as a co-conspirator. The FBI has also referred the case to the IRS, based on irregularities in the financial records they uncovered. I was sitting at the kitchen table. Through the window, the oak tree had lost most of its leaves. "When will it go to trial?" I asked. "Barring delays." "Spring." "But Margaret, I want to prepare you. The prosecution will want you as a witness. You will sit in that courtroom and testify, and Craig Sutton, or whoever they've retained for criminal defense, will attempt to cross-examine you. They will be looking for anything that makes you seem unstable, vindictive, or unreliable. Let them look, I said. The months between the indictment and the trial were strange and slow and populated with an enormous amount of paper. There were depositions, meetings with the federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Janelle Carter, preparation sessions with Robert that sometimes lasted 3 hours. Karen flew down twice. Thomas came with his wife and stayed for a week in March, sleeping in the same guest bedroom where Karen had slept in the February after the funeral, and somehow the symmetry of that, the house absorbing grief and resolve in the same rooms, steadied me. Diane and Gerald had retained a criminal defense attorney named Frank Aldrich, who had a reputation for aggressive cross-examination and a willingness to attack the character and memory of opposing witnesses. I knew this going in. Janelle Carter had told me directly, "He will try to make you seem like a grieving widow who is confused or a vindictive woman who is exaggerating. You are neither of those things. You know that. I need you to project that from the witness stand." The trial began in April. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined from television, and more fluorescent, and the smell of it, institutional, faintly warm, paper and old upholstery, was nothing like the solemnity I had expected. I sat in the gallery on the first day, watching. Gerald sat at the defense table in a dark suit. He had aged since August. He did not look at me. Diane sat at the same table, near Aldrich, and she looked at me once. A long, direct look that I met without expression and held until she looked away. The prosecution's opening was methodical and factual. Janelle Carter was not theatrical. She presented the case the way you would explain a mathematical proof, step by step, each piece fitting precisely to the next. The timing of Gerald's life insurance purchase. 18 months before the faked death, after a notable increase in his relationship with Diane. The collaboration with a corrupt medical examiner who had since lost his license. The fraudulent death certificate. The wire transfers that had moved money between accounts in the weeks before the staged heart attack. The rental of the Frisco house, 3 months before Gerald's death, in Diane's name. Aldrich's opening was louder, faster, more aggressive. He used the word confusion 7 times. He suggested that grief could distort memory, that an older woman's certainty, however sincere, was not necessarily reliable. He said the word widow in a tone that was meant to convey fragility. I sat in the gallery and thought, all right then, your turn. I took the stand on the 3rd day. Janelle Carter's direct examination was careful and deliberate. She walked me through the 38 years, the marriage, the signs I had missed, and the signs I had not. She asked about the parking lot in August, and I described it precisely in the plain, factual language I had rehearsed, without embellishment and without tears. She asked about the Sunday visit to my living room, the threat that the investigation would not be one-directional. She asked about my granddaughter Lily's nightmares. I described them, and I watched 2 members of the jury lean forward. Then Aldrich stood up. He was a large man, deliberately large in his bearing, the kind of advocate who uses physical presence as an instrument. He began with a voice that was almost friendly, not warm, but the performance of warmth, a studied pleasantness that I recognized immediately as the same register Diane had used at my door in her pearl earrings. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you're certain about what you saw in that parking lot?" "Completely certain," I said. "You hadn't been sleeping well. You'd been grieving for 6 months." "I sleep fine," I said. "I've always slept fine." A flicker. He adjusted. "The man you saw, you didn't approach him immediately, did you? You followed him through the store." "I did." "And your heart was racing. You were in shock." "My heart was behaving normally," I said. "I was surprised, not incapacitated." He tried a different angle. He suggested that the therapy I'd undergone after Gerald's death, 2 months of grief counseling, which my medical records confirmed, indicated emotional fragility. I explained calmly that seeking help when one is grieving is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of good sense. He suggested that the insurance money I had received and spent constituted a kind of complicity, a willingness to benefit from the fraud. Janelle Carter objected, and the judge sustained, but I answered anyway, clearly, before she could stop me. I spent that money believing my husband was dead. The moment I discovered he was not, I reported it. Benefiting from a fraud you didn't know was a fraud is not the same thing as participating in it. I'd expect a lawyer to know the difference. There was a sound in the courtroom. Not laughter. Something quieter. The jury was watching me with attention that felt different from the attention they had paid before. Aldrich's pace had changed. He was no longer moving with the unhurried confidence of his opening. He went back to his notes. He asked me 3 more questions, each one smaller and more cautious than the last, and then he sat down. In the gallery, I could see Dorothy, who had come to support me. She gave me a single nod. I stepped down from the stand and walked back to my seat. And I did not look at Gerald. But he looked at me. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. I spent those hours in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse with Karen, Thomas, and Dorothy. We drank too much coffee and spoke very little about the case. Karen told a long, funny story about something that had happened at her son's school play. Thomas and Dorothy discovered a shared opinion about a particular kind of gardening and talked about it with an intensity that under ordinary circumstances would have struck me as peculiar. I was grateful for all of it, for the noise, for the ordinary human persistence of conversation, for the way people who love you will talk about school plays and roses to keep you in the present tense. My phone rang at 3:47 in the afternoon. I stepped outside to take the call. When I came back in, I sat down, and Karen looked at me and I said, "Guilty. All 4 counts." The sound Thomas made was involuntary. Karen put both hands over her mouth. Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. I sat there for a moment, and let it be real. The sentencing hearing was 6 weeks later. Under federal guidelines, Gerald faced a significant term. The 4 counts, the scale of the fraud, the elaborate and premeditated nature of the scheme, and the existence of a co-conspirator all weighed heavily. Diane had attempted, during the trial, to position herself as a woman who had been deceived by Gerald, who had not understood the full extent of what she was participating in. The financial records told a different story. There were transfers she had authorized, communications she had initiated, the lease on the Frisco house in her name signed 4 months before the staged death. Judge Sandra Weatherly sentenced Gerald to 9 years in federal prison. Diane Mercer received 5 years. Craig Sutton had negotiated nothing. Frank Aldrich's appeals to Gerald's age, his lack of prior criminal record, his charitable history, had moved the judge not at all. I watched Judge Weatherly's face as she read the sentence, and what I saw there was not indifference, but a kind of precise moral attention, the face of someone who has weighed the facts and arrived at their correct value. Gerald turned and looked at me as they led him out. I had thought about this moment. I had imagined, in the small hours of many nights over the past months, what I would feel when it came. I had imagined rage, or grief, or triumph, something large and definitive. What I actually felt was much quieter. It was a recognition, a closing. 38 years of a life, some of which had been real and some of which had not, arriving at their actual end. I looked back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply looked, the way you look at something you are setting down after carrying it for a very long time. Then the door closed, and he was gone. The insurance company had already begun proceedings to recover the fraudulent payment. Because I had cooperated fully and reported the fraud the moment I discovered it, my legal exposure was minimal. Robert Delaney had ensured that. The house was mine outright. We had paid off the mortgage years ago. The remaining insurance money in my account was being held pending the civil recovery proceedings, but Robert was confident that my good faith status would be recognized. There were other details, practical ones, the kind that arrive after the large things are settled. The finalization of legal documents, the dissolution of the marriage under circumstances that required no contest from me, the quiet, bureaucratic work of untangling a shared life from a fraudulent one. Karen helped with most of it. Thomas handled the financial questions that required more patience than I had in those weeks. But one afternoon, in the early days of summer, I sat alone at my kitchen table in the quiet house and did something I had not done since February of the previous year. I made myself a proper cup of tea, not the sleep tea, the good tea, the expensive kind I saved for ordinary pleasures, and I carried it out to the backyard and I sat down under the oak tree. The tree was green, full summer green, extravagant and alive, rustling with a small wind. I sat there for a long time. I thought about Gerald planting that tree the summer Karen was born, 41 years ago, young and hopeful, and probably already complicated in ways I had not yet learned to see. I thought about the years beneath it. I thought about what survives betrayal, what you keep, and what you are forced to let go. I thought, I am still here. And then I drank my tea, in the green shade of a summer afternoon, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt no weight at all. The first year after the trial was the year I learned what peace actually felt like. I had thought I knew. In 38 years of marriage, there had been good years. Contentment, warmth, comfortable rhythms. But much of what I had called peace had been the absence of disturbance, which is a different thing. True peace has a quality of fullness. It is the sense that the life you are living is genuinely, unambiguously yours. In September, I did something I had talked about for 20 years and never done. I took a watercolor class. I was enthusiastically bad at it for the first 2 months, and then merely mediocre, and I loved every minute. I painted the oak tree 4 times. I framed the fourth one and hung it in the kitchen. Dorothy and I formalized our Thursday evenings. A book a month. A growing group. By spring, 7 women met weekly, talking about books, gardens, grandchildren, and the particular texture of lives that have survived difficulty and come out the other side. Lily was 9 now, with a fierce interest in birds that had become my own. We bought matching field guides and argued in whispers about warblers on the porch. Thomas and his wife came for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and a random Thursday in March just because they wanted to. I drove to New Mexico with Dorothy and walked among the red rocks at sunrise, feeling very small and very alive. I repainted the bedroom a deep, warm blue, chosen with no consultation, no compromise. I loved it completely. This was my life. It was considerably more than enough. As for Gerald and Diane, Gerald was not adapting well to federal prison. Charm is not a useful currency there. He had developed real health problems. He was, by all accounts, a diminished man. Diane was released to find everything dismantled. Her real estate license had been revoked, her savings largely seized. She moved to a city where she knew no one and started over with nothing she hadn't earned the hard way. I thought about her sometimes. The yellow blouse, the pearl earrings, the careful performance of reasonableness, and felt not triumph, but a quiet clarity. She had wanted a life and chosen the worst possible method of building one. The currency she'd used was someone else's suffering, and it had not held its value. I had lived honestly. It had cost me more than I felt I could afford. But what I had arrived at, this kitchen, this tree, this life that was unambiguously mine, had been purchased fair and square, and it was worth every cent. So that is my story. I am 68 years old, sitting in my kitchen with good tea, morning light, and a half-finished watercolor of a warbler. The oak tree is visible through the window, simply and enormously itself. What did I learn? That being underestimated is an advantage if you understand it correctly. That honesty is not passive, it is a choice you make again and again under pressure. That the truth doesn't need protecting. You only have to tell it. A life cracked open at its center can be rebuilt into something real and entirely your own. What would you have done? If this story moved you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it, and stay for more. Thank you for listening.